What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the All-In Woodsman. Today we're going to be doing a recipe that I'm super excited to try out. We're going to be working with a rack of venison ribs that I took off my last deer, and I'm super excited to try this recipe out. If y'all want to see how it turns out, stick around and watch the video. Okay, so we have this beautiful rack of ribs that I got off the deer that you saw me kill in the last video. That little buck, we got him quartered out and ready to go to the processors, but I went ahead and snagged a rack of ribs because what I wanted to do was try and cook a cut of meat that normally you would either just cut up for ground sausage or ground venison. You just kind of clean it up and move it out. You don't even worry about trying to use it as a cut of meat. So I wanted to try in my best and see how a recipe would turn out using the entire rack of ribs off of a deer. And so that's what we've got here. We've got a beautiful rack of ribs right here, ready to go. Got it cleaned up already. I'm going to tell you what I did to them before this point. That way you know what to do with yours if you're trying this recipe. Luckily, this was an archery kill, so the cleanup on it was a lot easier than if it had been a rifle kill. Not saying you couldn't do it with a rifle kill, but I think there would have been a lot more muscle tissue and sinew that was bloodshot or destroyed with the rifle just because of the force and the impact that it has in that round. But with this being an archery kill, it was relatively easy to clean up. What I did was around that exit wound, I just cleaned off as much of that bloody tissue, sinew, silver skin as possible. Because you don't want that in what you're cooking, obviously. And then I went around the outside of this rack of ribs, and there's just a fine layer of just nasty, grimy sinew, silver skin that kind of was just stuck to the outside. And I spent about 10 or 15 minutes just slowly, methodically with my knife, taking that off. I did find that once it got down to the really small stuff, I grabbed a paper towel and just allowed me to get that traction once my hands were a little slippery. It was harder to hold on to that silver skin. So I just grabbed a paper towel. It allowed me to hold on to that easier while my knife was working on taking that off. So I also, on the backside, there's a layer of, it's a membrane, just like you would have on a pork rack of ribs. There's a membrane that runs over the entire back, and you don't have to take that off. But with pork ribs, I found that if you take that off, it's a whole lot easier to eat, a whole lot more tender. You just don't have that extra layer of sinew that's trying to break down while you smoke these ribs. So I went ahead, just like I did on my pork ribs, and took that sinew off the back of these ribs. That way it was ready to go. It was relatively easy. All I did was take a butter knife, work my way down one of those ribs, and that sinew just kind of started coming up. Ran my finger all the way along one bone, and then started working my way out to the ends. And it came off relatively easy, so I don't think it should be hard for you guys to do. But then also what I did was I didn't just take the rack of ribs itself. What I did was I took the rack of ribs, and there's a layer. If you've ever processed a deer on your own or butchered a deer, you're gonna know that there's a layer of meat on top of these ribs. And there is a layer of sinew and connective tissue between those two layers. But because of the such little amount of meat actually on the ribs, I wanted to save as much meat as I could on these ribs so that I could get as much meat up on the end process or the end product. So I left that on. I did have to take some of that outside layer off around the exit wound, but I left as much of it on as I can, and I'm hoping that sinew layer in the middle is going to just process out during the smoking process. But we'll see. First time doing this recipe, it could be a complete bust, but I wanted to see what we could get done with this rack of ribs. So I'm going to clean my hands off real quick, and then I'm going to show you what we're going to do. So I've got 3 steps to how I'm going to do these ribs. First off, we're going to start by using your favorite barbecue rub. I've patted these ribs dry. I've got my favorite barbecue rub right here. I found this at Walmart. It's Kinder Seasoning. It's their barbecue blend. This is, I don't know if that even focused on it, but that's a super small bottle, so I did pick up 2 bottles because I'm pretty sure it's going to take at least both of these. Then we're going to let that smoke. We're going to cover it. We're going to cover all sides. And we're just going to let it take as much. I'm not using a binder of any kind on these ribs. I'm just going to let the ribs take as much of the seasoning as it wants, and whatever falls off, that's fine. Second step, we're going to let that smoke for a couple hours on the smoker. Then the second step, I'm going to pull them off. We're going to wrap them in aluminum foil, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour just a generic Coke in. You could use cherry Coke, you could use any kind of liquid you want, but what the goal is at this point is going to be it's going to steam these ribs. So we're going to put them back on the smoker, wrapped in aluminum foil with whatever liquid you choose to use. I'm using Coke. I normally use a cherry Coke, but I don't have one of those at home today. We're gonna pour that in, put it back on the smoker, and let it go for another hour to 2 hours. And that's gonna heat that liquid up and steam these ribs and really make them tender and fall apart. That's kind of the stage of the second stage, is kind of making those ribs as tender as possible. And so when that gets done, we're gonna pull them back off, take the aluminum foil off, get rid of the liquid, and then at that point, we're gonna take your favorite barbecue sauce, whatever you got. We normally do a really spicy barbecue rub, but for this one, we're just gonna go nice and simple with a plain barbecue rub. This is a local company called Williamson Brothers. All right, so I moved the GoPro angle around, that way y'all get an actual angle of what I'm doing with these ribs, nice, close, and personal with them. That way y'all don't have as many questions about what I'm actually doing. So what I'm gonna do is, they've been sitting for a little while, so I'm just gonna go take a paper towel, dab as much off as I need to, flip them over. They're pretty dry, but just around the edges. And like I said, I just kind of cleaned these up as best I could. There's obviously some extra on here that you would not get with pork ribs. They're a little more processed when you get them from the store. But like I said, I processed this and quartered it out myself. So it's definitely not as clean as you get from a butcher. But we're gonna go with it and see how it turns out. Just getting it all cleaned up, making sure there's no hairs on it or anything like that. But see, y'all can see right here, this is that layer I was telling you about. It came all the way across here, but I had to clean this area right here up just because of that exit wound. It was kind of bloodshot. So we cleaned that up. You could take that off if you want, but I left it on just to get as much meat on these ribs as possible. The funny thing is, you don't realize until you start actually processing animals, but like the ribs for this one wrap all the way down and around. So it may just be that in a normal processor, they would have cut that off, so you didn't get that part. So we'll see when we actually start cutting them up later, how they turn out. Hopefully the meat just falls off the bone and we don't really have to worry about it. But we're just gonna get started. First steps first, we've got our barbecue seasoning. We're gonna go ahead and open that up. And we're just gonna we're gonna coat as much of these ribs as possible. Like I said, you can go super heavy with this seasoning because what we're doing is there's no binder agent like a mustard or something like you would use on a Boston butt. I'm just literally gonna take them like this and then shake them, and whatever comes off, you can see some fell off right there, that's fine, but it's gonna hold on as much as it can. Now, some people say you don't need to do the backside, but I always at least put a little bit on that backside because guess what? There is meat between those bones and you're gonna want that meat to have some flavor. So we're just gonna wrap it up there. Make sure to get the edges. Let it fall off. We're gonna flip it over and we're gonna get these little areas that we missed on the side. And if you have this flap here or have a piece of meat that kind of pulls up, I always like to dump some seasoning back up in there. Any way to get that seasoning all up in this meat and dispersed throughout is going to be beneficial. So just catching all the little areas that I've missed. All right. I think we're good to go. So that's going to be what it looks like after stage one. Just going to have your seasoning on. I used a dry rub, obviously, but just as much as those ribs will hold, that's what you're going to put on. Now let's go get these things on the smoker. All right, we're out here at the Pit Boss. We got the Pit Boss running at about 250. It is pretty cold out here today, so it's only running at about 180 to 200 internal temperature. That's why I've got it bumped up so high, knowing that it's going to be hard for it to stay at that temperature with it being as cold as it is out here. But what we're gonna do is we're just gonna take these ribs and I'm gonna place them right there. The way my grill works, I have a cold side here, then the heat and the smoke run through and out the chimney. So this is kind of my hot side. I'm gonna start them off there. They look like they're getting a little too done. We may bump them down towards that low side. I just don't like putting anything right here because this is where my firebox is at underneath. So it kind of is really my hottest spot, but I like to cook the majority of my food on this side of my smoker, but we're gonna let those smoke at about 200, 275. we're gonna start off with 2 hours. So we'll see what they look like at 2 hours. All right, here we go. Hope you guys can see that. It's been right at 2 hours now. We're gonna go ahead and pull them off. They're definitely looking dry in some spots. 2 hours may have been a little bit too long, but we're gonna get them off, wrap them, and get some moisture back in them with that steaming process. Like I said, we're gonna put the Coke on them, wrap them up, and let them steam for probably about an hour. And we'll see how they turn out. Like I said, this is a trial run, so we'll see how it works, but that's after 2 hours of being on the smoker. A little dry maybe, but I'm hoping that moisture from the Coke is gonna rejuvenate some of these ribs. I mean, they don't, especially that part up top does not feel super dry. Just the pieces over here kind of by themselves. So probably best off to leave that cap on top if you're possibly able to. All right, let's get inside, wrap them up. All right, so we're in the kitchen. We're just gonna grab these off, set them down right here on aluminum foil. And we're gonna wrap this up. Sorry for the noise in the background. I don't know if y'all can hear that or not. All right, we're gonna wrap this up nice and neat. And then this is where we're gonna pour in our Coke. We're gonna pour our Coke in right here. I'm gonna use 1 can of Coke into this, okay? So 1 can of Coke. We're gonna finish wrapping this up. Make sure you got a nice tight seal on that aluminum foil, or else you might lose some of that steam, while also being careful not to let the rib bones poke out the bottom. I've had that happen more times than one. All right, we're gonna gently try no leaks. Let's move outside. We'll move back out to the smoker. Nice and gently, again, try not to poke holes in them in the aluminum foil. And now we're going to gently lift up and sat back on the smoker. We're gonna let it go for probably another hour. Probably check it at an hour and see how they're looking. And then we may let them go a little bit longer, but we'll figure that out in an hour. Okay, so we just got our barbecue sauce in a bowl here. You're just gonna take your basting brush and you're just gonna slowly baste that over the ribs. The goal here is not to like overpower them, but it's just to give these ribs a little bit of that barbecue tacky sauce that we all love on our ribs. So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna generously put this over. And what you're gonna do is, once this gets on there, we're gonna put it back on that smoker just so that it gets a little tacky. So right now it's not super tacky. It's gonna be a little loose and runny. That's why I'm kind of just putting it on as best I can. And then that's gonna get tacky as that heat starts heating up the sugars in this sauce. I'm gonna grab a little more of my barbecue sauce. And then you're just gonna try to get all this stuff all over the edges. It is a messier process, so we're just gonna get this nice and coated. And you can even go back on a couple times, like so if you want a heavier coat of sauce on your ribs, what you can do is as you put it back on the smoker, when it starts getting a little tacky and it's not gonna smear, you can even go back around and put another coat of this barbecue sauce on while it's on the smoker. It all depends on your personal preference. But I'm not gonna worry about doing the backside. We're just gonna get this top side covered good. But as you can see, nice and covered with that barbecue sauce, nice and tacky. Like I said, just use whatever barbecue sauce you like. Spicy, not spicy, sweet. As long as it's got some sugar content in there so it can caramelize up on the outside, get a little tacky, it will work perfectly fine. So let's throw these back on the smoker, and we've got just a few more minutes before we can taste them and see what the product tastes like. Alright guys, so here they are. Final product coming off the smoker. I will say they're definitely, to the naked eye right now, they definitely seem stiffer and not nearly as tender as a set of pork ribs. But like I said, we're experimenting here to see what happens. So I'm gonna flip it over. This shows just the good rib markers. Let's just cut through real quick. And like I said, the bones wrap around the bottom here, so next time what we may do is come in here and actually cut along this side to kind of give us more of a clean set of ribs instead of having this undercarriage, I guess, kind of come through. So I'm just going to grab my kitchen shears and clip through that. That way we're not having any issues there. All right. There's that. Basically what I'm doing, y'all, is just following along the segments in between, just like you would a regular set of ribs. There we go. Let's see. There's up there. Let's turn over. All right. Let me see if I can show you guys up close to the camera. So, definitely very little meat on the actual rib cage. The meat you're seeing right through here, this is that extra layer that we left on. So I would definitely recommend, just from looking at it right now, if you can leave as much of that second layer of meat on, probably going to be a good call. It just gives you more meat because the actual rib bones and the meat in between dried up pretty significantly in smoking. Don't know if y'all can see, but there's a pretty nice pink smoke ring around the outside from the smoker. So, I mean, they look good. I mean, there's not a lot of meat on there, but we knew that to begin with. So I'm gonna finish cutting these up and move the camera around. That way y'all can see my face, and we will give them a taste to see what they taste like. All right, guys, so we got them broke down. I will say, just you gotta be a little careful with the further down you get on the rib cage. I took almost the entire rib cage off. You do, where those bones kind of wrap around the bottom, you do end up running into the portion of the rib cage. So if you're not going to take that portion off while you're butchering it, just know when you get to the point where you're actually eating it, it's really going to take some effort to get them cut into individual little pieces. There's still some good meat on the top of this section here, but you may not be able to actually pull it apart and eat it like an actual rib. So with that being said, we got the rest of them pulled apart. Definitely got some good color on it. Right there. And let's give it a taste. Is it a little chewy? Yeah, it definitely could. We probably could have played around with the times a little bit more. Like I said, this was basically a trial by fire recipe to see how it turned out. Either they could have gone a little longer or a little lower and slower potentially. It's got a great smoke ring, good flavor. But they're definitely on the chewier side. Phoebe down here is saying that she would not mind either way. Definitely not your fall off the bone pork tenderloin or your pork ribs, but are they the worst thing in the world? Absolutely not. Good flavor. I think the more meat that you're able to leave on those ribs, this is kind of a last minute thought for me as I was processing this deer out, but the more meat you can leave on them during cleaning and processing, I think the better off you're going to be. You're going to have more chance for that meat to get tender, as well as less chance of it getting tough on you. But if you're bored one day, or if you're not going to do anything with the ribs and you want to give it a try, give it a shot. Like I said, we'll play around with it in the next couple years as we get some more deer. We'll probably definitely do this again and play around with the times a little more. Maybe we go a little bit lower and slower. Let them go for a little bit longer. Maybe they become a little more tender. Might even try them in like smoking them some, then throwing them in like a crock pot. Who knows? But that's going to be a wrap for today's video on venison ribs on the smoker. Give me a big thumbs up if you liked the video. If you've ever tried a recipe with the venison ribs, the ribs of a deer, drop it in the comment section below. Would love to know your feedback on how yours turned out, or if you give this recipe a try, drop a comment down below and let me know how they turned out. Would love to get your feedback. But guys, as always, no matter what you're doing, we just want to make sure you're all in, and we will see you in the next video. All right guys, so I actually had a thought. I was in the process of cleaning the ribs up, and I had a thought. They are very tough, almost, I won't say inedible, but they are definitely tough. But I think I thought I might have undercooked them in the sense of not letting them slow cook long enough, and that may be the case, but there were also no guidelines. This was just a recipe out of my head. And so I think what happened was the fact that there was such little meat on there, I think was my downfall. I think I actually let them go longer than they were needed to. I think I potentially overcooked them, which can also create tough meat. And so I think, because there was a couple spots that had thicker meat than others, and those pieces, they were a little chewy, but they were actually edible. And so I think what I probably should have done, and what I would recommend to you is, if you're gonna try it, is considering there's such little meat on these bones, what I would do is probably put them in on the smoker for like an hour, pull them off, baste them, put them back on for 30 minutes and pull them off. Because this venison cooks really fast, and I kind of forgot about that in this process, but pull it off, put it on for an hour, baste it with some barbecue sauce and pull it off and give that a try. That's how I'm gonna do it the next time I get a deer, and just give it a try, because I think going that route, it will be less chewy and a little more tender, just because you're not overcooking the meat. So we won't know until next time until we get a deer, but I just wanted to let you guys know that I kind of had an epiphany that we might have gone the wrong way of going low and slow for a long time. Potentially low and slow for a short time would have done the exact same thing while keeping that meat relatively tender.